CEO, Osiju. Hello, my relatives. Good to see you here. It's an honor to be here on a Cheyenne and Arapaho land. Any Cheyennes or Arapahos here today? Yeah. Statement. Statement. But we'll come back to that. I want to thank Roya in particular, who is something of a magician. Other people for organizing, but my old truck broke down north of Chattanooga on the way here. I managed to get back to Atlanta, too late to possibly drive. They said, you know, it's going to be another day for truck can possibly be repaired. I might arrive on Sunday, which is the last day. I've already checked airlines and can't find a ticket for less than $1,200. I would break my taboo against flying and fly, and somehow or another she came up with a ticket, and here I am. So I'd like to have a round of applause for duty above and beyond. I'd also like to thank the last speaker for giving me some examples, not the least of which is sitting down, which I'm sure the cameraman there is much appreciative of. I tend to pace when I'm standing up to talk, and that's really hard for the guy trying to record the event. I'll come to some of the other things by way of example in a bit. But it was begun, the last session was begun with a little bit of self-description, so I'll do the same. I don't know how to do the order on these things, but I'll do the order by which I identify. I am of Chalagi, otherwise known as Cherokee. I'm possible Creek, possible African American, Teutonic, Scots, Irish, other Gaelic peoples. I'm a mutt. By identifying a certain way, and I've tried to comport myself in accordance with that way and see the world in accordance with that for a long time. I'm a Vietnam combat veteran. Some of you may have picked up from the cap. Life member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. My background is a little different than the last speakers. Not only because I was on that side of an anti-imperialist struggle. I was part of the colonialist or imperialist army and drew certain lessons from that. That was a galvanizing experience. I was also involved in armed struggle on the other side of that during the 1970s. But that wasn't across an ocean, that was right here. That was right here. I was actually cut my political teeth in something called the Rainbow Coalition. I know everybody's thinking about Jesse Jackson at this point. No. Rainbow Coalition was put together initially by Fred Hampton, and a guy by the name Bob Lee. Hampton was deputy chair of the Black Panther Party nationally and chair of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. Assassinated by the state on the 4th of December 1969, along with my sometime roommate from Peoria, Mark Clark. On the SDS side of that, SDS dissolved in '69. I was with Weatherman for a while, not the Weather Underground. Weatherman was the initial manifestation. And then for about better part of 40 years, I've been with the American Indian Movement. I was for a while a co-director of the Colorado chapter and on the leadership council thereafter until last year when I moved to Atlanta. I haven't found any active Indians in Atlanta just yet. I'm working with the New African Grassroots Movement primarily down there, but I guess I'm still who I am, so I am Georgia AIM for the moment. That's a sad statement, and we look to change that. But I'll be coming from that particular perspective. And I'm also going to narrow the focus a little bit of the talk, because there's no way of getting through something as ubiquitous as capitalism, a subject quite that broad. But I want to narrow, you'll see, I think, the connection between the broadcast topic and the way I'm going to shape this. I'm going to go to the notion that democracy, no democracy, can be predicated in lies. Cannot. Now that could lead to a big conversation about the education system and the news media and the interlocking propaganda network, manufacturing consent, Chomsky and Herman, and yeah, all that's true. But those lies would include lies we tell ourselves because they're comfortable and convenient, rationalizations in which we engage, the terminology that was used in terms of seeking our own vision of the world, the journey of what our life be. And I, as I did during the session last time, or at least the after talk portion of it, affirm the idea, you know, too many people running around trying to figure out what they're going to do. What you got to figure out first is who you're going to be. But in figuring out who you're going to be, just like in making political decisions, you kind of got to base this in accurate information and accurate understanding of what the reality is you inhabit. And it takes me to a long time ago, or some people would consider it a long time ago. To me, it's kind of current events. Back in the early 80s, when we were doing a physical land occupation outside of Rapid City in Kanyenzi, Tioshpai, Yellow Thunder Camp, Lakota initiative to begin to take back the land that was stolen from them in the most sacred area, not site, in their cosmology, the Pahasapa, Hisapa, Black Hills. And I was doing security work those days, among other things. And one of the things security did was go over to the res, which wasn't that far away, to see the old people, stop by, see what it was they might need, firewood, water brought to them, whatever. We stopped at Matthew King's house. Matthew went by the moniker of Noble Red Man. He signed documents. He was basically the translator for Fool's Crow, who was of the traditional chiefs, pretty much the acknowledged head. Noble Red Man. See, if you come across reference to Noble, we're talking about the same guy. We came, he didn't really need anything, but we sat under the arbor as is customary, and he brought us coffee. It was about 105 degrees, but coffee is essential, coffee and tobacco. If you do not have those two things going in a traditional indigenous context on this continent, basically you're being impolite. You're being disrespectful. You're being a bunch of other things. A little bit different moray than running around plastering no smoking signs and drinking lattes. Okay? Then we were talking, just conversation, and all of a sudden he kind of looked at us. He spoke to the whole group of us that were sitting there, about 8 of us, coming in 2 vehicles. He said, you know, I really admire you boys. He said, you standing up for our rights, which is a misnomer in a way, because Lakotas have no conception of rights, got a conception of responsibilities, and that's a very different thing. But in order to fulfill your responsibilities, you've got to engage this other society in a discourse that it understands, and that comes out as rights. So rights to the land, rights that are defined by treaty, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, in that particular instance. So you're standing up for our rights. Basically said, you got endless courage. You feel yourself puffing up. Okay? At that point, counterinsurgency war that had recently been wrapped up against the American Indian movement had resulted in about 70 deaths, 350 odd really serious physical assaults, all carried out by the FBI or under the auspices of the FBI. That's a different story that I'm not going to go into. You just need to acknowledge it. This is what he's talking about. But he says you cannot win. Well, that's kind of disheartening. You can't win. So what are we supposed to do? Give up? No. You can't win because you don't understand your history. You don't understand your history. You don't know it. Now you need to look at this. Like a journey across these plains, he says, you get out on those plains, there's no markers to tell you where you are in the old days. People look back over their shoulder at a tree or a rock formation or whatever. Once they got out there, you have to keep looking back over your shoulder to figure out where you are at this given moment. And only in knowing where you are at this moment can you figure out what direction you need to head in order to get where you want to go. You can't take these things apart. The present, the past, and the future are of a piece. Of a piece. If you don't have the past, you don't have the present. And if you don't have a grip on the present, you cannot win whatever it is you're trying to win because you have no idea where you're going. U.S. history is a lie. It is from start to finish a lie. But the nature of the lie is such that it precludes any possibility of people in a general society, no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how humane, no matter how comfortable I'd be having dinner with them, can't possibly figure out what to do in order to change things in the way they think they want to change things. The reason being, they don't really understand the nature of the society in terms of its historical evolution. Reference was made to the American dream. That's a really telltale term. Dream for who? Dream of what? Assume that it ever really existed in the form that it is sort of reflected in nostalgic terms into the present. Was it a dream for American Indians? Ever? Was it a dream for the people who were dispossessed of the land they were guaranteed under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 when the U.S. seized the northern half of Mexico? And I could make some arguments about Mexico. However, we're not in Mexico, so I'll talk about where we are. Was it a dream, do you think, for the Chinese coolie laborers that were consumed, not having a Chinaman's chance of survival in the construction of Leland Stanford's Transcontinental Railroad or his portion of it through the Sierra Nevadas in the 1860s? That American dream or American nightmare? And if it was a nightmare for, say, the fruits of the transatlantic slave trade, or American Indians, or the people living north of that border, which defines the demarcation between the United States and Mexico, and for certain communities of Asian Americans, and in some ways you could even say all, and for that matter, if it was a nightmare for those they now call Appalachian whites who were brought in to do deep shaft mining that was too life-threatening for good people to be recruited into performing. If it's a nightmare, and it has always been a nightmare, for these appreciable sectors of the population, how can we refer to the American dream? Were these people ever part of the American dream? Were the slaveholders who were dreaming of what it was they were going to create, including the slaves in a dream? Were those who were, I heard the term, going off into the wilderness to actualize themselves, considering indigenous peoples to be part of the dream of what they wanted to constitute? Is that why the population of North America and the U.S. portion dropped in the 90th percentile between when the process began and when they took the 1890 census? Is that part of the dream? Were they included? Those coolie laborers, were they included? No. Were they included in Emerson? Were they included in the flow of literature that defines what would be the noblest aspects of them? No. You know as well as I do, they weren't. That flow is a white supremacist stream of consciousness and celebration that leads to a triumphalist iteration of history, which is guilty not only of falsification, lies by commission, but more importantly, lies by omission and evasion. In order to apprehend the reality, you have to somehow or another make the translation for the stations of each of these component parts, which was a problem with something that had great potential. And that was, in fact, the Occupy movement. Now, some of what I'm going to say here does not pertain to Denver, because Denver's kind of unique, the Denver Occupy movement. But don't get too carried away, you're not that unique. But unique nonetheless in a way that I will define. Okay? I have absolutely no issue with defining the 1% and making them the target of wrath. And I'm not particularly choosy what kind of wrath that is that they're targeted with. But now we come to the business of the other 99%. We're 99% and all the same insofar as perhaps we're not part of the 1%. And one of the reasons it was kind of hard to build a narrative, a story, a set of goals and objectives coming out of that very good recruiting slogan to get people mobilized and on the street wasn't narrative. It wasn't an absence of narrative, it was an absence of analysis. An absence of understanding of what the 99% actually is. And guess what? A mid-range corporate executive who's actually making decisions over people's lives in order to acquire the affluence that attends his position, Eichmann in other words, in Ward Churchill speak, is not somehow or another on the same ground as the guy living under the bridge down here by the Platte or in Atlanta where I live. Those who have come into Cheyenne and Arapaho territory without even knowing whose territory it is and set up shop here to conduct themselves in whatever fashion, progressive, regressive, reactionary, however, are not on the same station as the people whose land it was that was expropriated. Guess what? Indians didn't disappear like the buffalo. In fact, the buffalo didn't disappear, and I can take you to see a whole bunch of them that are not up for commercial usage so that you can buy the proceeds down at Safeway or what is it out here, King Soopers. This land that constitutes the territorial corpus of the United States, this entity that we're trying to come to grips with, okay? It was all owned in Western vernacular by somebody. There wasn't any of it that was simply vacant. Not that mythology, the mythology that led to, 847,391 living people north of the Rio Grande at the point Columbus set foot on what he called Hispaniola. Wow, how did I come up with 800 and blah, 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 blah? Right down to the particular person, because that was what was inscribed in an introduction to anthropology, American anthropology, text for the 1950s. I actually got a copy of the book, and they understood if you make the numbers sound really precise, it'll seem much more plausible than a round number estimate. The round number estimate that Kroeber and others came up with was 1 million. 1 million people north of the Rio Grande, including Greenland, which somehow became part of North America. 10,000 Inuits up there in Greenland. Well, if there's only 1 million people for that entire continent, a couple things. One, most of the land was vacant, so nobody was harmed by us coming in and taking it. So no need to feel any kind of strums of consciousness, no cognitive dissonance, nothing like guilt. Guilt's not a very constructive emotion in any case. I feel so guilty, I just can't do anything about anything ever. Oh my. You can't do anything about what has happened other than to come to grips in consciousness of what it was that was done and the implications for the nature of the society you inhabit now. Okay? Yeah, that takes us to the second piece. There were about, now I'm rounding off, there were actually a little less than this, but about 250,000 Indians identified as such remaining in the United States as a whole, according to the 1890 census. Now it's a 75th percentile population reduction. That's not a bit worse than the Nazis. And actually, I've seen that argued and heard it argued. Well, that's the way your consciousness is going to work, is that, hey, we're no worse than Nazis, so we don't need to worry about it. ... I'll let you fill in the blanks of where that one's going to go. But the fact of the matter is, you probably got closer on to 15 million people that were here. And there's estimates that run higher that are based on actual arithmetical formulas, archaeological evidence, and so on. But I'm a moderate in all things, and so I'll stick with the moderate range of 15 million. When you get to 15 million, you're talking about 97.5%. Oops, they all just died of disease and virgin soil epidemics. No one was responsible. Well, yeah, actually, someone was responsible for that too. And right from the get-go, they weren't as ignorant of how disease, they didn't, in scientific terms, understand the mechanisms, but they understood about the communicability of disease. Even if you frame it just as simply as we come, they die in massive numbers, that's remarked continuously from Columbus on. We come, they die. They attribute it to the hand of God, and I will grant you that's not much of an explanation other than to anoint yourself as a superior chosen people. The response to that was not to back off and figure out what was going on. In order to alleviate that catastrophic effect when you approach, it was to accelerate the rate of contact in so-called settlement. Most of those settlements, incidentally, were set up atop existing Indian towns. That begins with Plymouth, which is actually called Patuxent. The town site was already there. It was marked on the map. And John Smith sat there with that map, which he had made and redesignated Plymouth, and we'll call it Plymouth Colony. Patuxent having been the principal village of the Wampanoags, who, guess what, died off of smallpox, easing the way for the Plymouth colonists to show in. Been that way all along. There is a direct correlation between the land, so-called wilderness, that was acquired by the influx population of the United States, the descendants of the English serfs, on the one hand, and the erosion of lands to which Indian held title. Right down to, you got almost exactly, proportionally, as much land left reserved under nominal Indian control at this point as you had population reduction, working off the number 15 million. Now, there's a lot of things that can be adduced from this. Okay? But just sticking with the land still nominally under Indian control. It means that there are remnants, as they're called, of those indigenous peoples. And there was a mechanism to legitimate or create the appearance of legitimacy over this essential confirmation of the Sartrean formulation that colonialism equals genocide. You cannot have colonialism without genocide. You can have genocide without colonialism, but not the other way around. So when we talk about colonialism, we are talking about a genocidal impact, and it's not just physical. In fact, even if you look at the much diluted 48 Genocide Convention, under Article 2, you'll find there's 5 categories of governmental policy, I would argue corporate policy as well, that can be pursued, okay, that will qualify as genocidal. That is, intent to bring about the destruction in whole or in part of a targeted racial, ethnical, national, or religious group. And indigenous people here, incidentally, qualify as each of those protected classes. All 4. Insofar as the United States wanted to create an appearance of legitimacy, I mean, you got the disease argument, as if smallpox blankets were never distributed. And I'll say this despite the recent history at Colorado, at Fort Clark and elsewhere. That was 1837, but there's a number of other instances. Disease was not accidental and inadvertent, and it wasn't based upon virgin soil, although that's no doubt an exacerbating factor. Okay, getting displaced, having your economy destroyed, dispersed, all the rest of that plays into it as well. Let me drive you out into the snow and the plains in the winter, and you have to walk 100 miles to get something to eat and to get warm. You're going to be highly susceptible to disease. Your resistance is going to be low. And that's a calculus that has to be entered into this. Well, it was done by disease, and so no one's responsible. Yeah, policy was responsible. Policy was responsible. And right here, in this city, there was a proclamation that was put forth to remove the Cheyenne and Arapaho from the Front Range of Colorado, or to exterminate them. In fact, you got a 96-point headline in the Rocky Mountain News, which used to exist, and they called it a newspaper. Okay, it's defunct at this point, thankfully. Exterminate them, exclamation point. That's pretty clear. You're talking about a policy-driven process that's covered by entering into treaties. Well, first of all, treaties, even under Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution, are reserved on the U.S. side to the central government, and the reason being because they're essentially contractual relations between sovereign nations. There's 400 odd of them. They used to say 371. There's 400 odd ratified treaties between the federal government of the United States on the one hand and American Indian people or peoples on the other. Each of those is a recognition that these are not internal parts of the United States. They are separate sovereign nations. They have to be, and that's the predication of U.S. title to the land, is that most of these are treaties of cession, reserving other portions to the people whose property it was. Okay? That's the U.S. basis for claims of some legitimacy in land title, and on that basis, the right to exercise jurisdiction, issue permits for things like mining and other corporate enterprises, and so on, and so on, and so on. But the nations still exist. The people still exist. They are nations recognized as such by the United States in formal sense. You know of any self-governing, self-determining American Indian peoples at the present time operating on the basis of what is understood in the Western tradition as national sovereignty? Name one.
Strong Heart. Strong Heart. Strong Heart with the Lakotas.
I've never heard of Strong Heart. Maybe an individual. It's not a people.
How about the Choctaws in Oklahoma?
You might want to go ask a Choctaw about whether or not they're under authority of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which some of us call the colonial ministry. We're sovereign. We got a letter right here signed by the Secretary of Interior. It says so. We're entitled to do whatever federal law allows us to do. There's a legal definition of the relationship involved. When one nation imposes itself on another, usurps its self-governing authority for economic, political, or strategic reasons, usually some combination, maintains that entity, that country, that nation in a state of subordination, actually subjugation in most instances, is called colonialism. It's not out there across an open body of blue water. It's right here, and it's internal. Internal colonialism is the edifice upon which the United States is constructed in physical terms, upon which capitalism operates, upon which the state functions. The story, the narrative, the experience, the reality of an American Indian, thus, is fundamentally different from that of the settler population. Those who chose to immigrate here did so, and often knowingly, at the direct expense of the indigenous population. The composition of the 7th Cavalry on the Northern Plains at the Day of the Little Bighorn, wild geese. Custer himself was Irish, 2nd generation. But Miles Kao, for example, who was commander of one of the troops, one of his immediate subordinates, was literally wild geese. He was born in Ireland, fought for the Pope, came to the Civil War, and then went to work for Custer. Shock troops of empire are often other colonized peoples. Ask the Sherpas. These are things that we understand out in the world, but they have to be understood here. The imported chattel slaves and their descendants constitute what was created by experience as a nation in its own right. You could view that as another internal colony. That's a little more complicated argument to make. Certainly you could make it with regard to the people in the land grants down in the Southwest, whose property prerogatives, whose territorial prerogatives were guaranteed by the United States. What happened to those land grants? Well, they were used for scrap paper. They were sold. Must have been too much paper to file. They sold it off scrap paper so no one could document the parameters of the grants. Reyes de Arena went to Spain and got copies of the originals. Is this internally colonized people? These constructions have to be understood. And if colonialism equals genocide, we actually come to this that was evaded. Fanon. Not the be-all, end-all, but a book to be recommended. And I'll recommend some others. Was the guy, I think the example Roya gave was, she got paid a lot of money, and her son just got a medal. Yeah. And it kind of subverts sense of identity and maybe values you thought you had when you get rewarded for being something other than who you thought you were. They'll buy you. Well, they bought Fanon, or tried to. He's from a colony, he's from Martinique, he's a black man. French don't necessarily look at black people with much esteem. They're colonizers. These are the colonized. But it's an old colonial sleight of hand to select some from the colonized to show that if you just are good enough, if you are just gifted enough, if you're just compliant enough, you can be like us. Or we'll put you in an intermediary point so we don't have to try to deal directly with the mass of your people. Black skin, white mask. He was in agony over having to emulate those he was not, who he understood, in an abstract, generalized sense, despised that which he represented. He could become the ultimate nullification of himself, or what he ultimately chose was to affirm his own identity, take that journey, and write Wretched to the Earth. And Wretched to the Earth was the exploration of how the wretched became wretched. Wretched was essentially correlated to color. In the domestic colony, they claimed Algeria as being part of the home compartment of France in order to avoid the international legal necessity of decolonization. He understood colonialism. To be colonized is to be destroyed. You will physically destroy one another from your sense of rage, helpless, hopeless, indoctrinated rage visited upon one another. The constructive thing is to understand the source of the rage, understand that it's natural and inevitable. Channel it into some constructive direction, the constructive direction in this instance being decolonization. Remove the source of the trauma, the pain, the emulsification. How do you do that? You kill your colonizer. You are ultimately, permanently, psychically, and otherwise disempowered until you equalize that flow of violence which is systematically imposed to maintain you in a position of ultimate degradation, denial of human value and worth. In that context, Fanon meant that literally. That was what was happening. In Wretched to the Earth, he writes about being an intern psychiatrist. He'd chosen Algeria to do his internship. He was trained as a psychiatrist. And in the daytime, he's dealing with the torturers who are traumatized by what they're doing. They knew it was wrong. He's dealing with the French torturers and their surrogates that are drawn from the ranks of the Algerian colonized, and dealing with the psychic effects of that. At night, he's dealing with those who were tortured. He's seeing both sides of the equation, understanding the cost and consequence. He died young. Where he would have gone from Wretched to the Earth, I can't say. But one thing may be, there are other contexts. I think maybe Sartre picked up on that. Sartre wrote the introduction to Wretched to the Earth. He said, there's a delusional aspect of French society. The distinction that is drawn among the colonizers between good colonizers and bad colonizers, don't be confused. There are only colonizers. There is no good colonizer. Kill the colonizer? How about your self-awareness? Kill the colonizer in yourself. You're not going to commit literal suicide, that's not required. But to come to grips with the nature of the position assigned you in this society, the function served by your unquestioning, unthinking participation in colonizing processes, and the affliction of the cost and consequence of that upon the usually darker other. You become that which you purport to oppose. Think your way through to it. Figure out who you want to be, colonizer or decolonizer. See what it is the colonized feel. To the extent possible, feel it. And act from that position as part of your own consciousness. Internalize that. Understand it for what it is. You will not be that, but you can help to end that, but you can only do that from a place of conscious primacy assigned to those who are hurt worst, maimed worst, deformed worst, traumatized worst by the functioning of society. There is a hierarchy in this society in terms of the administration of authoritarian rule, but then there would be a hierarchy in every aspect of its functioning, including a hierarchy of oppression. You begin with the most oppressed. You take a radical analysis. You go to the ground, the root, which is what radical means. It doesn't mean extreme. And you work it back up from there. And you do not take positions which are essentially privileged positions of rearranging the relations of society among the colonizers in order to be more comfortable in your role as an unresisting member of the colonial society. To be an active anti-colonialist is another matter altogether, but that's an aspiration. How do you do that? How do you kill the colonizer? It's a matter of consciousness. How does the colonized kill a colonizer? That may be something else again, but you can understand it. Not to condemn it. What is to be condemned is the unilateral infliction of violence by colonizer on colonized, not the other way around. Much was made of Summerhill. I mentioned Frere. We had schools. I mentioned a place called Blackstone on the south side of Chicago. That is the heart of the South Side Black Ghetto. And there were schools functioning there, including delivery of breakfast for children who didn't have breakfast. Those schools, which were run by the Black Panther Party in Chicago, that Breakfast for Children program, which was run nationally, and there were schools other places as well, were declared by J. Edgar Hoover to be the #1 target for elimination of the Black Panther Party, 5,000 strong nationally. 5,000 people, #1 internal security threat to the United States. Why? Because they were essentially the crystallization of what was called Black Power. What was Black Power? Essentially what Fanon had said. No, we reject integration. We do not want to be considered good enough to be like you. We want to be who we are. And we are going to have the power, we are going to take the power to be who we are, to realize our vision in our own communities without interference from you. Thank you very much. That's all it was. The repression came down on that basis. The fact that people shot back is what they should have done. To do otherwise is to be completely disempowered and ignored. We'll talk about Blackstone later. That's another situation from what I'm talking about. Yes, it is, and it is one that has to be talked about, confronted, or what we have is a white privileged discourse. We have recipes for white people from relative positions of privilege to feel better about themselves. I'll tell you what. Feel better about yourself when we win and decolonization has occurred. That will create a new social construction. What will it look like? I don't know. Self-determination for indigenous people may work in a completely different way than I would hope it worked. It's not for me to say. That's what self-determination is about. But if you want to take a look at this, the book, I know one person in the room has read it, Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. It's very much still in print. You want an overview of the so-called progressive movements that have held sway and are mostly remembered in American mythology? Try J. Sakai. Settlers, the mythology of the white proletariat, which is how the labor movement excluded blacks from day one, and what was done to the Chinese. How it was done, why it was done, chapter and verse beginning in colonial Virginia. Carrying up, well, the book was published along about 1990 originally, so it doesn't go forward beyond that. Things have happened since then. But hey, guess what? I'm getting to be an old guy. In fact, I'm getting to be a dinosaur all my life, I've been told. But don't you think it's getting better? That's not a question. But don't you think it's getting better? No, I think it's getting a hell of a lot worse. I see the effects. I live with the effects. Yeah, I had a residence outside Boulder, but I worked on Pine Ridge. I worked down at Big Mountain. I'm getting too old to be a regional traveler anymore. But on the ground, it looks a whole lot different. Living in Blackstone is a whole lot different from living in Hyde Park if you're on the south side of Chicago, and we got to put that into the computation so that it works out, so there's something to aspire to for everybody. So we don't call ourselves in the same position when the net wealth of the average black family in the United States as a result of the Grand Recession is now about $5,000. The net wealth of the average white family, which is not all that well off in this particular society, still about 90. Don't tell me we're in the same positions. Tell me we have a nuanced analysis that takes this into account, and we are going to jointly, in some sense, create a vision that takes all that has been considered and transforms it actually into something else. Where I'll end is with this, and I've said this in a lot of contexts in times past. Let's take the standard script, the so-called progressive agendas that are out there. Let's say tomorrow we ended sexism. We ended militarism. We ended racism. We ended ageism. All those other isms and a few ologies that are on the list. That somehow or another we constructed a society tomorrow based upon the elimination of all those things. If you have not eliminated, if you have not dealt with, let me put it this way, if you have not dealt with that fundamental issue of whose land this is, and arrive at an accommodation of their rights and entitlements as human beings to restore dignity and self-determination, you will remain a colonialist nation. And colonialism being the foundation for all the rest of this we're talking about, at least in its manifestation in particular form in this country, you simply recreate what it was that you had just overcome. First Peoples, first priority. Not the end of the game by any means. But what we have now is the reverse in most of these discussions, where indigenous people don't even come up. That's absolutely unacceptable. That is absolutely the colonialist mentality working among people who would think of themselves as being anti-colonialist. That's profoundly important to address. Okay, that's all I'm going to say for the moment, so takas. I got to ask a question to the group before we go any further. Is there anybody in here who I did not manage to offend in some fashion? Oh, phooey.
Thank you, Ward. I just want to tell a very short story before we start our breakout sessions. As a person who was born and raised in Iran, as a Middle Eastern, when I was growing up, my father was an activist and he was working with Mossadegh, which nationalized the oil, trying to nationalize the oil in Iran. And finally, CIA brought the Shah back, and because of course they wanted to exploit Iranian oil wells. And I was always very angry at Americans, always very angry at Americans. I say, why can't they see? They are exploiting us, they're exploiting us. I didn't understand till I came to this country, and I see in Colorado the mineral rights, the oil, everything belongs to a private company or private person. And when I talk to people, that's accepted. That's accepted. Oh, we have a capitalistic society. But I said, owning minerals, owning oil, in a state by a private companies is not a capitalist framework. This is exploitation, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's part of the capitalism. But I just wanted to tell you, I forgiven Americans for that, and I forgot about what I was thinking about. I think, as Word says, everything begins here. And many people say, why don't you fight with the Iranian government? Why don't you go and do that? Because I feel that all those are puppets. I need to be here and I need to fight the belly of the beast, the corporations who are trying to exploit Americans in this land and, doing in other lands. They are located here. And so I am in a right place to fight. So anyway, thank you.
I forgot one thing which I said I was going to do, and so it's not to diss, and I think it's important. I don't want to diss anybody, all right? Here's why I said Occupy Denver was different. American Indian Movement put together a position paper, really, short statement, on indigenous rights, the implications of indigenous rights right here, but also more broadly everywhere in the country, the significance of that. Occupy Denver endorsed it and sent it on to other Occupy movements. It was absolutely rejected in Albuquerque as being, quote, divisive, end quote. We all have the same rights. It's all our land jointly. Excuse me. Any colonizer can say that. It was rejected in New York. And I hate to say it was rejected in Oakland because in some ways had most affinitive with what was being done in Oakland. So y'all were unique in that regard. And I think that displayed a consciousness worthy of being emulated elsewhere. Thank you very much for it.